Our speakers can actually see you and make eye contact. There's nothing better than making eye contact with your audience. We're going to start our lightning talks, and we have some dynamic speakers that are coming up in a couple of seconds. So we're going to keep it succinct. We're going to do it fast and furious, but you're going to get some awesome information. So if you're going to take notes, take some pictures, all that cool stuff, we ask you to do that. So let's start. It's 1:30, right? We're going to start on time. 1:32. So I ate up like 2 minutes. So I'm going to stop talking. So let's start with Scrum for Developers, Jenny Beaumont. Let's give her a hand. Come on, this is like WordCamp US. Come on, give it up for her. You're quite welcome.
Okay, Scrum for Developers. The stereotypical developer works alone, at home, without pants. Oops. He knows better than everybody else. He hates change requests, but he hates meetings even more. And above all, he does not like to be managed. In real life, the developer works more often in an office and hopefully with pants. He is, of course, also she and they, and we never work alone, right? Whether you're building bespoke websites or plugins or themes for distribution, whether you work at home or from an office or from a beach in Thailand, you're at the very least going to be brought to work with your customers or clients, and more often than not, with other developers, designers, and specialists in their field. We collaborate with others so that we can improve our products and services, so that we can improve ourselves and our work, and to do that, we need to be able to communicate effectively. The word Scrum comes from the world of rugby, and whether or not you like rugby, this image tells a compelling story about a team huddled together as a single unit, working together to accomplish a common goal. Outside of rugby, Scrum is a framework for delivering complex projects. The roles, language, and ceremonies of Scrum provide us a playbook for effective communication. Dave West says, unlike in sport, Scrum encourages you to always be sprinting so that you can deliver working software while continuously learning and improving. This is the embodiment of Scrum. Now, before we can actually talk about Scrum, we have to talk about Agile, the philosophy on which Scrum is based. The Agile Manifesto defines these 4 values and says that while we value the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. We value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. There's often confusion, but Scrum and Agile are 2 different things. Agile is the philosophy. It's an attitude. It's a set of values and principles that serve as a guide to use to fall back on when confronted with difficult situations and decisions, while Scrum is the practical implementation of a delivery system. So I wrote this talk for developers and for talking to developers about Scrum because of some of the cultural hurdles and the stereotypes on both sides. These are things that I have encountered again and again in the 20-some-odd years that I've been working in the web industry. There's this idea, and it's not specific to developers, to be honest, this idea that real success can only be achieved alone. And because you're alone, you think you have to know everything, which leads people to think that they need to know better than everybody else. And that's just impossible pressure to maintain. The fear of change is something that we all have, right? And I've always found that ironic because we know that change is inevitable. And when we embrace change, we learn as we go. We embrace it, and we allow ourselves to build better products and services, and we get better doing it. Now, similarly, I don't think anybody likes meetings, am I right? Especially the introverts among us. They take a lot of energy. And a lot of times they're called without real purpose or tangible goals, and nobody likes to have their time wasted. And managers can also have a bad rap. Some can be rather domineering, maybe a little micromanagey, and nobody either likes the feeling of having somebody breathe down your neck, putting pressure on you to perform. So Scrum addresses these hurdles. It empowers cross-functional teams to self-organize. It embraces change as a normal part of the iterative process. And it clearly defines roles and ceremonies that are both value and goal-oriented. Okay, yes, there are a lot of meetings in Scrum, but each has a very specific purpose geared toward discovery, transparency, and focus. In order to build great things, we need to understand what we're building and why. We need to evaluate the risks and the challenges. We need to test the results of our work. Are we on the right track? Are our customers responding positively to what we're building? What have we learned that we can use to improve? So let's run through the events really quickly. The sprint is the heart of Scrum. It is the time box cycle, typically 2 weeks, but it doesn't have to be, that we define for delivering value on a project. What does that mean? Well, we don't want to build something that somebody doesn't want, right? So rather than building a whole thing and waiting till the end to deliver it and get feedback, no, we're going to build things in smaller increments. We're going to deliver small pieces frequently, get that feedback quickly, and then incorporate it back into our work. The sprint plan is not a plan insofar as we think we have everything figured out in advance, because that never happens. It is a meeting to set the goals for the sprint. And knowing that we're going to discover things as we go. We define our tasks for the sprint based on those goals and what we think we can reasonably deliver. The daily Scrum. Yes, it's daily, but it's the best meeting ever because it only lasts for like 10 or 15 minutes. And it's a great opportunity to touch base with your team, to make sure that everybody's on the same page and delivering on their commitments. A typical stand-up asks each participant, what did they accomplish yesterday? What are they going to do today? And do they have any problems or impediments they need help with? Sprint review occurs at the end of each sprint and often includes stakeholders. They're an opportunity to showcase your accomplishments, to demonstrate that functional working software, and to get feedback on it. This is an interactive process. And they're an essential part of the iterative process because it creates real visibility for everybody involved. And finally, we've got the sprint retro. Now, this is probably my favorite of all of the sprint ceremonies because it creates a real space for the team to evaluate how they're doing. It's a chance to not only celebrate everything that you're doing right, take a look at those things that are going well so that you can keep doing them, but also to take a candid look at what's not going so well and take actionable steps to correct them. Now, when implemented correctly, all of these meetings are time-boxed, which means that meetings don't run over. You give yourself a specific amount of time to focus on necessary aspects of each sprint so that communication is optimized and you create a sustainable cadence for the whole team. So let's look at the team. What's the first thing you notice? There are no project managers on a Scrum team. Now, this can be very disconcerting for the project managers amongst us, but that's going to be another talk for another time. No, really, there will be another talk. So let's look at the product owner. The product owner is the person who keeps everybody focused on the business value of what's being built. They've got the big picture view. They know what we're building, but more importantly, they know why we're building it. They are generally in charge of maintaining and prioritizing the product backlog, maintaining the budget, and both reporting to and protecting the dev team from various stakeholders. The Scrum Master has two very important tasks. The first is implementing Scrum. making sure that communication is open and transparent, and that everyone understands the goals and the scope of the project. And secondly, removing any impediments from the Scrum team that might prevent them from achieving their goals. Scrum Masters are not merely meeting facilitators, and it's not just another fancy word for project manager. They play an essential role in setting the tone for the team's interactions and for orchestrating a productive working environment. And then we have the dev team, which can also include designers, accessibility experts, and anybody else who is responsible for deciding how to build the thing and then doing the actual building of it. Nobody tells the dev team how to do their job. They are empowered to organize themselves, to consider the goal set before them, and create their own path toward achievement. But with that great freedom comes great responsibility. And for a team or a developer that seeks autonomy, you've got to be willing to make the commitment to the project. I know developers for whom Scrum is not a good fit, and that's okay. Some people prefer to execute without having to be responsible for the deep problem solving and the decision making that comes with an agile team. The trust goes both ways. And when it's in place, when all parties are working openly, in full transparency, taking responsibility for their work, for solving problems together, it's beautiful, a joy. We challenge ourselves and we challenge each other, and that shows in the work. We end up building some pretty extraordinary things, and we can have a lot of fun doing it. Props to my colleague Than, who found this. This is from Alan Cooper, the father of Visual Basic, who touched on something really important in this Twitter thread, and that I find is overlooked in the general discourse when you hear people, when you hear developers especially, resisting or arguing against agile methods. It's a problem that you have to show your work. You have to be willing to expose work that's less than perfect to your team members without fear of being judged. So a successful Scrum team is a team that cultivates an environment of safety and trust. Scrum is not a silver bullet for project management and delivery. Similar to code frameworks, a lot of times they are much easier and more straightforward in theory than in practice. In the end, we're all just people, flaws and all, and no framework is going to replace the hard work and the determination that is required to have an effective, open, and transparent communication. And this is where we have Agile to fall back on and to look to for help, because it's always people before processes, always. I'm afraid that's all the time I have. I have put together some resources for you here. My slides are online. I'm going to tweet them out after this talk. I will be at the Happiness Bar just after 2, so if you want to dig in more and talk with me, I would love that. My name is Jenny Beaumont. You can find me at Jenny Beaumont on all the things. I am a senior project manager and certified Scrum Master at an amazing company called Human Made, and we're hiring, so you can come talk to me about that too. Thank you for listening.
How about that, Scrum? Give her a hand again. Thank you very much. Okay, so in the words of my kids that I teach, everybody is lit and dope and awesome. So make sure you're taking notes, okay? All right. I believe our next speaker is Dwayne McDaniel. If I said that correctly, give him a hand, everybody. Good to see you. Good to see you.
See you, sir.
And the title of his presentation is Nobody Wants a Website, They Want Results. Isn't that true? And we find that all the time. So we're going to take some time and let this young man speak. Thank you.
Oh, I was at the end of my slide deck. You're going to see the whole talk in reverse real quick. All right. Oop, almost there. There we go. Nobody wants a website, they want results. I'm not a young man, but everything else you said was true. If you want to get a hold of me, best way to get a hold of me is always going to be Twitter. I love Twitter. It's the best social media platform of all time. All my slides and everything I do are on my indie web project of mcdwayne.com, which is WordPress. If you ever want to talk about anything besides anything I'm talking about today, please hit me up about crochet and karaoke tonight. How about the wild beaver at 10? Everybody? Everybody? Yes. I got a project I'm doing this year, so excuse me for just a second.
Take a picture, y'all. Take a picture.
27 members this year. Animated GIF will be posted later. Why am I talking about this thing? Nobody wants a website? Because in WordCamp Baltimore 2017, I had a conversation about discovery process, and someone in the audience said, the point of a website is to unite a branded or a common theme. And I said, I don't think so. I think a website does what a website's supposed to do. That's whatever a website's supposed to do. Because nobody really wants a website after all. And half the room did this. And half the room did this. And I said, you know what? That means there's a good conversation that should be had here. I firmly believe that inside of this room, inside of most rooms I ever talk about this stuff, that there's a collective knowledge that's way better than what's in my head. And I would love to learn about you all. I don't have a lot of time, but very quickly, who here is involved in the business process where they work? I wrote this talk for you. But what I found out giving this talk is who here works in internal projects on teams? It's actually for you. And as we go through here, I hope to explain that. So the whole rest of this is about this process of lining up our expectations and results. And I feel every designer in this room cringe. My expectations for this slide is it would say these two words, and it works. No other expectations were met. But if you expect something like that, then you get good results. But if you expect something like Elmo and you get a red monster like that, you're going to have a very cranky child on your hands. And as we all know, clients are really cranky and act like children. I mean, they also act like mobs sometimes. And this is actually a real problem. So to get sober and stern for a second, this is a real quote I'm about to show you from a real CMO who worked on a $250,000 project that kind of spiraled after that. And he said one night drunk to me, Dwayne, they don't take their fiduciary responsibility seriously, that we pay them a lot of money to do these websites, and they don't even bother to find out what we're trying to do, and we just keep throwing money at it. And who here thinks that this CMO is recommending that firm for another project? Exactly. And that guy knows a lot of people. He's in Silicon Valley. So we can fix this, though. There's a really good way to fix this. And I think the problem stems from that CMO when he said, I'm going to hire a web development team. The web development team heard, hey, they're going to hire a web developer. And this is what the web developer said in their head. I'm going to make the best piece of technology to do a website in the world. And it's going to be awesome. And what the business owner, the CMO in this case, thought was, I'm going to hire a firm that does all of these amazing things. And I'm getting at the price of this single developer. That's amazing. And there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with that. But how do we prevent that world of, I think I'm hiring that, but I'm really just hiring this. Or I think I'm just doing this, but I'm expected to do all of this. And I think process can save us. I'm a firm believer in processes. Good processes mean good communication. We just heard about Scrum. We've heard about good things this time around. But this, who here has never seen a project funnel before? Awesome, we can save some time. So as things move through a project funnel or a sales funnel or any other kind of funnel, there's things you can do, people you can talk to, people that actually need you to do the thing that you can do, people that will actually pay you to do that thing, and finally the people that you actually did the thing for. Moving through that process, well, is literally a system. The part that comes first is figuring out, can I work with this person? The more time we spend here, the less time we have later to actually deliver the thing and actually write good proposals. So, I want to talk to you the whole rest of this time about how we can improve that qualification process. I'm going to talk to you about it from a sales perspective because I have a long background in sales. But this works for internally as well. Do we have a budget, authority, need, time frame to get this done? Did somebody actually approve this project to say, yes, we can do this project? Awesome. Do we have a timeline? Is there a drop dead date? I firmly believe if you don't have a drop dead date, you don't have a real project. Can you pay for this thing? As a sales guy, I can tell you that's the only one I cared about. All the others, I can figure out if you got enough money. And need is the one I always neglected. If you're talking to me, obviously you need my product. Why else would you be talking to me? I make this assumption. Unfortunately, need is the hardest one to nail down for a lot of salespeople, for a lot of business. And you don't step back and say, why are we doing this? What are we actually trying to get done? Instead, we just dive in, two-fisted, and we're trying to get it done, whatever that thing is. Because they're talking to you, of course they need your thing. We don't step back and say, well, what are you actually trying to do? What's the goal of me working with you? What is the thing that I should produce at the end that makes value for you? And if they've done their homework, they're going to have some SMART goals for you. I like SMART goals because they're well defined on the internet. I didn't make this up. You can find this everywhere online. SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant. Relevant, you're never going to be able to tell that for sure working with an outside firm. An inside firm, you can actually ask these questions. So where does this tie back to our higher goals as a company? Nothing wrong with asking that. You're not saying no. You're just asking for a better definition. Time bound, of course, I already talked about that. Measurable is the one I want to talk about, though. Measurable is the most important one on that list, because if you can't measure something, you can't improve it. You can't actually get it done. There's Lord Kelvin, the guy that invented the Kelvin scale. He said this and a bunch of other really, really cool stuff. You read his Wikipedia article. But this is my favorite thing he said. And fortunately, very fortunately, this is a very well understood thing out in the world. In fact, marketing people tend to refer to it as this: KPIs. Who here uses KPIs in their business regularly? Look around the room. Seriously, keep your hands up, people. Find these people later and ask them how that has changed their business and how it affects them and how they think about numbers and metrics. That's an important conversation I want you to have. I think we can tie that into the qualification process. And if someone says, I want you to do a project for me, I think you should say something like this: so do you got your KPIs defined? And most people are going to give you a blank stare and have no idea what you're talking about. Because most people don't live in the world of KPIs. Marketing people do. But you can ask everyone, what are we going to measure? How are we going to know when we're done? Because what are we going to measure? And if they look at you and say, I need my leads to go up by 30% in the next 120 days, that is a yes or no, black and white. We did it or we didn't. But if they start talking and explain a business model, and honestly, you have no idea what they're saying, that's a giant red flag you should walk away from or run and never talk to them again. No, I'm kidding. If you're an internal team, though, and they start saying, start trying to boil it up again, what is the goal? What's the number? How am I going to be measured on success here? All managers understand that idea of success. And it might be, if you're working as a consultant or an outside firm, that you could say, you know what? You need a business consultant. And I am willing to change hats right now and charge you for being business consultant. Who here thinks that a web developer doing WordPress and a business consultant should make the exact same rate? Not a single hand in the room for those people at home. I firmly believe that too. Those are different jobs. Because a business consultant is going to say, all right, a web developer is going to give me these numbers, but I don't really care about these numbers if I'm marketing, because I'm a marketing person, I care about these numbers. But a business consultant can say, hey, these kind of map together somehow. And then you can talk to the salespeople and say, the salespeople care about these numbers, which, again, aren't these numbers or these numbers. These are different numbers. And ultimately, we got to talk about these numbers. What does the business owner actually care about? All of this is Googleable. What do business owners care about? KPIs, business owners, KPIs, salespeople, KPIs, marketing. That's where I found this. Anyway, a business consultant can look at these and say, I'm going to tie these together for you, and we're going to figure out a strategy for it. At least a good one will. At least a good one that's data science driven. Not all business consultants are the same. I firmly believe in the data science model, that we look at the real data and we move those needles forward. And if you look at real numbers, it's all math. You can just put it all together. Average data scientist starts at about $140,000 a year, in case you're curious, if you want to go down that metric path. And you can definitely make algorithms. Don't use this verbatim in your business. It won't work. But you can make metrics like this, algorithms like this, that will start saying, all right, we can get to your business owner KPI. We can solve the problem. We can get to the goal that you actually want to do. But business consultant was one of the things on that list they think you're already doing. So in your qualification process, again, this is literally the first 5 minutes you're talking to this person about their project. Not the first 5 minutes of all time, but first 5 minutes about you're seriously talking about, can we work together? It's like, well, do we have a plan for these other things? Like, what's your content strategy? This is the way I've gotten out of almost every every website anyone's ever wanted me to build. It's like, I want a website. I'm like, what's your content strategy? And I never hear from them again. Oh, one exception, my sister, who did an awesome job on her content strategy. Go, Deb. What's your plan around design services? Because a designer and a back-end dev are two different jobs. They just are. I am a terrible designer. I have borrowed all of these slides from the internet. What's your plan about project management? Ooh, this is a fun one. Am I going to report to someone on your team? Who is that person? And when push comes to shove, what happens? Have you defined this? If so, they have a project management team internally that says, yeah, we know exactly what to do. Here's how the process goes. I would try to join that company. They're amazing. What's your social media game? Oh, we have a Twitter account. How much other work are you going to have to do for them? Versus, oh, we have this entire media library that floats out to like 15 different sources and yada, yada. I was like, all right, you got that figured out. Good to go. I don't need to worry about that. Because those are all different jobs. And it's up to you if you want to do any of those jobs. Literally, you get to make the decision. Or do you just want to be the developer who sits there and codes and delivers a tech product? That's awesome. Thank you. You can work inside of a larger organization that delivers those things. Or if they're just hiring you for a specific job, do that one specific thing. And then spend all of your time delivering. But the only way you can do that is you spend almost no time in the things above it, the things that take, honestly, the longest time, because I might talk to 100 people to qualify them into like 40 people that I could actually talk through with the discovery process to get to 10 proposals, and I'll probably lose 8 of those. That's just reality. I'm expensive. But that's a lot of time. I want to spend all my time in the delivery aspect. So let's optimize. Let's ask these questions earlier. Let's say, hey, you want me to do a thing? Explain the business value to me. No, don't be a jerk about it, but say, look, I'm just trying to understand how we can better meet your goals. Because at the end of the day, nobody actually wants a website. What they want is the results that website can give them. And hopefully we can measure that with KPIs, because that's pretty easy math. You're supposed to clap along with Picard and Riker. No idea why Picard's mad at Riker right there. But I'm Dwayne. I work at Pantheon. Please reach out to me on Twitter. But I want to have a conversation really quick with you. Don't have time for Q&A, but really quickly, anybody here that charges for discovery in your business, please raise your hand. Look around, look around. Anybody, just keep your hands up. Anybody that doesn't charge for discovery, also raise your hand. And the first group, put your hand down. All right, the first group, people in the second group, talk to people in the first group, find them and say, hey, why do you charge for discovery? Or why don't you charge for discovery? If you can have that conversation, I'll felt like I've won WordCamp US. So thank you very much. I'm Dwayne. There we go.
All right. I'm really impressed because anybody that can have Picard and Riker applause needs another applause. So let's give them another applause. Thank you. We're going to ask again that the young people that are sitting in the back, yes, even if your beard looks like mine, you're considered a young person. If y'all can scoot forward, and the ladies as well, because y'all don't have beards, but I'm talking to, and inward as well. So I'm getting directions from, please come from the back and on the outside inward, so that way the people that are coming in have room and they're not stepping in front of you or anything like that, trying to take a cupcake or anything out your bag. So please cooperate and move up. I don't want to use my teacher voice, so please cooperate with us. Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Mr. Ryan King. Did I say that correctly? And he is speaking on WordPress as Project Management Hub. So let's give him a hand. Come on up. As they say, come on down. Good to see you, good to see you. All right.
All right. Good afternoon. Happy WordCamp 2018, everyone. My name is Ryan King. You can find me online at all the things at Ryan Can Help You, the tweets, the Instas, Facebook, you name it. And if you go to ryancanhelpyou.com, you can find these slides and additional resource links. I am the digital experience designer at the Smithsonian's Freer-Sackler Museums of Asian Art. I work both in code and design for both online and in gallery digital projects. And as a quick aside, I met my current supervisor right here at a local WordPress meetup group. So I always like to do a quick side shout out just to attend, support, and learn from your local WordPress meetup groups. Like most organizations, we needed a place for staff to create and share documents, submit work requests, and track projects. We needed something that would be easy to use and quick to go in, find what you were looking for, and move on with your work. So I put in effort into creating an intranet. We have roughly 116 staff members spread among various departments with different information needs and tech abilities. The museum had gone through a rebranding process and developed a new strategic plan. Better and more efficient data sharing was identified as one of the solutions we needed, and something that was truly collaborative in nature. It was also ideal timing to examine our internal workflows and consider tools to streamline those processes. We actually already had an intranet, but it wasn't ideal. Built in SharePoint, our old intranet was used mostly for forms and primarily by our finance department. There were some useful resources, but a lot of it was orphaned and overlooked, and few people knew about it. David Zwiegel said it best during his presentation at WordCamp Baltimore in 2016, SharePoint is a place where documents go to die. We investigated existing off-the-shelf solutions such as Jira and Basecamp, but while Jira worked well within our digital media department, it is heavily software development focused, and the interface just proved a little too daunting for the majority of our staff who needed just quick access to files and to update work orders. One of our interns, Haley, surveyed staff to establish what they wanted and valued in the ultimate solution, and from her work, we knew we wanted something simple, attractive, and intuitive, which led to our newest incarnation, built-in WordPress, which is more user-friendly than SharePoint, and by rolling out our own solution, we were able to customize a platform built solely on WordPress that is specific to our needs. We are huge advocates of open source, and especially WordPress, to power our projects at the Freer Sackler, and we also hold the belief that as a public institution, we should share our code as openly as available and make it as openly available as our collections. And so we started with the prototype and reached out to key stakeholders across the institution to test it at milestones along the way, which allowed for a rapid feedback loop and buy-in. And we held a naming competition staff-wide, also for buy-in and a sense of ownership, and just to have some fun with it, creating a shared identity, and also which resulted in the name Zoku, and was part of our launch party and product rollout to generate energy, curiosity, familiarity, and exposure, weaving the Zoku brand as part of our institutional culture. As mentioned, forms and work orders were an integral part of what we needed. We have forms for design, publications, web, AV, video, social media, etc. And we established policies around those workflows in order to cut down on back and forth emails and just walking into people hallway requests. And so that now we only work on tasks that are officially submitted through the proper channel of Zoku, and we won't begin work until we have all the content. It also helped on the user end to standardize the information our colleagues submitted and served as a checklist to remind them of the types of details and associated media we need to complete certain types of projects. And so with WordPress and conditional form fields, we were able to simplify the work orders to only display the prompts necessary to specific projects. Certain administration fields, such as assignee, are hidden to the end user, and it also creates one central place to group content and attachments along with the work order instead of tracking down things in emails or paths to files on our internal server. Staff were also thrilled with the level of transparency this provided. They could log in any time and track the status of the request or submit edits. It also helps with setting expectations and scope creep. They can see our full workload, and it's helpful when discussing timelines so that they can see the other projects we have on our plate beyond their own and can prioritize accordingly. Finally, notifications are another important part of the system. An email notification is the default whenever someone submits a new work order, but if the user selects high priority, we also get pinged in our group Slack channel. So to combat some of the previous issues, we asked departments to appoint a web content liaison to update departmental pages. These content champions or leads were trained on how to edit their sections, and we keep them on an email list to send quarterly reminders to update their content. So this contributes, again, to a sense of ownership, and a lot of them had fun creating specialized and unique pages showing a real sense of pride for the department and work, and we also hosted brown bag demo sessions to roll out Zoku to all staff. And we tried our best as well to pay attention to all the small details and just customizations from even the login page. So because we're a governmental institution, the login had to be locked down and tied into our Microsoft Active Directory through an LDAP plugin. So that way it's the same login our staff use for emails, etc. However, typically on a default WordPress install, you'll have the lost password link, and that allows you to reset it. However, since it's tied to LDAP, we had put in some custom code and created a plugin so that it directs them now to a help page with the IT number they need to call to reset their password. And as well with governmental, when you're working with governmental or even certain corporate entities, you always want to be aware of your client's legal specifications. So we need privacy policies on all of our documentation, or all of our pages, etc. And as well, we wanted to work with our various departments and users to see what types of information they need to quickly get to. So we have all of our quick links on a drop-down menu. And one big part of that as well is all of our new staff onboarding documents and processes are listed there as well. So it serves as kind of a checklist as well of things to get their ID badge, their computer set up, as well as kind of giving a sense of our organizational culture and putting a face to all the staff. So how do we piece all this together? So far, I've really been, so far what we've done is focus on the people part of the equation, which I can't overstate how incredibly important that is when setting out to create tools or products for your clients. Now I'll be touching a bit more on the specific WordPress plugins and pieces of the puzzle we pulled together to roll out our custom intranet. These two in particular I use on almost all of my projects. Custom post type UI and advanced custom fields. And while as a developer you can definitely handwrite all those codes, I find it easy and I recommend it for a couple different reasons. Number one, it adds a graphical user interface. So it's quick and easy as you're kind of iterating and changing things up on the fly. It also allows you to export that code out into your own custom plugin if you wanted to go that route. Or if you're working on client work, for longer term maintenance, depending on the client and what kind of access you want. It's kind of nice for them to, in the future, work with someone to update any of the custom builds they need or post types they need. On top of that, I do want to mention there's also a great website, generatewp.com, that does essentially the same thing. And if nothing else, it's also just kind of a visual checklist of all the items that you need to put together for a custom post type or a custom field. And you can use that if you don't want to have additional plugins in your install. In terms of security, I mentioned the LDAP login, Active Directory sync, but members is another great one for restricting users and giving them unique roles. So our general departmental, as I mentioned, each department has a content liaison, so when they log in, they'll just see the areas that they need to edit, and they don't have, either they won't get into the other sections, and also it just makes for a cleaner user interface for them. Enable media replace, I also use on the majority of my sites. It's kind of nice, so that way, if there's a second version of a PDF, they can just go in that media file, and it just says replace media. They upload the new version, and it saves all the links and everything else, and that way you don't have many, many versions in your media library. It just kind of copies over the existing one. Now, WordPress in general is amazing both in terms of the community that we have as well as the high quality plugins and kind of pieces that we can use to build these things out. And there's, in particular, forums, just a plethora of really quality forums out there. Ninja forums, Caldera forums, Contact Forum 7, WP forums, many, many, many of them. In this particular instance, however, we decided to go with Gravity Forms solely because of the vast number of add-ons and integrations that we required. But I will mention this is a paid plugin. But even so, going into this and a couple of the other paid plugins, the cost was another reason we went with WordPress as opposed to an off-the-shelf solution that I mentioned before. It's just drastically more cost-effective. We do use Asana as a project management tool within our department, and so this is nice that any of the forms or work orders that are done on our intranet can be fed into Asana. We also, as I mentioned, try to meet individuals where they are using the tools that they use. So we've worked with other contractors that work heavily with Google Forms or other items, and so we can also pipe in any of these work order requests into a Google form or a Slack notification. The other great thing with Gravity Forms is they have a very good ecosystem built around it. And so a few screens back when you saw the work orders, those were powered by Gravity View, and there's also Gravity Flow, which can help with notifications and workflow steps along the way. And then finally, in all projects, you should delight your users with kind of unexpected niceties and special touches. One in particular I mentioned is the MIME types. It's great because it automatically will have like a PDF icon or a Word icon next to any linked item, and it will also auto-generate the file size for that. Finally, in terms of maintenance and upkeep, there were 3 key areas that we really honed in on. One being the technical maintenance, the other being content, and then the third being the people side of things. So we definitely keep all of our plugins updated instantly, and then, if we don't, we'll hear from our IT Central and everything else. So that's kind of nice to have that extra check-in. But always you want to keep plugins up to date. You want to test additional integrations to ensure they don't break. In terms of content, I mentioned already that we send out an auto quarterly email to our content liaisons to keep the content fresh and updated so it doesn't become a SharePoint graveyard of documents. On the people side of things, we continue to have feedback, ownership, gentle reminders, and nudges, and also all staff email just to reiterate and keep in everyone's minds the proper workflows and how to submit job requests. So what's next? Gutenberg, we are looking at how what blocks mean in terms of our templates, plugins, and widgets, and continuing to investigate tighter integrations and workflows. And that's pretty much it. I will be at the Happiness Bar later if you have any questions. So please stop by or reach out to me. I always love hearing input and comments. So thanks. Happy WordCamp.
Okay, before we move on, it's not really easy to get up here and talk to your peers. So let's have our speakers stand up again. Let's give them a round of applause. Because this really is work, and you get your emotions going and your adrenaline running. So just sit tight. We're going to have another speaker come in just a moment. If you have to go to the restroom, hold it, because we got some great content coming your way. So just stay on just 1 minute.
They do have 15 minutes. And then can you tell them that there's a lost cell phone?
Good afternoon. We like to start on time here at WordCamp US, but I'm going to provide you with a couple of announcements. First of all, there's a new word going around, and that new word is called scooch, if you haven't heard of it. If you have kids, you probably know what scooch means. So we would like the people on the outside to scooch in a little bit, if possible. So that means that there's room for others that are coming in a little bit later to find some place to sit. And definitely, if you're all the way in the back, scooch up to the front a little bit so that way we have some room. So the outsides and the back, come on, we're all family, get a little closer. Share some business cards. Because my belief is if you come to WordCamp and you have a pocket full of business cards, your business cards should be gone by the end of the day, and your pocket should be full with everybody else's business cards. How's that sound? All right, so I have a couple of announcements. First of all, there's still a cell phone out there. Who is missing a cell phone? Okay, come on now, come on. If it was a kid, they would have picked it up like 30 seconds ago. All right? Also, the swag store upstairs is going to close at about 4 o'clock. So if you haven't picked up your WAPU, I shouldn't say picked up, purchased your WAPU or T-shirts, okay, come on, let's get it. Let's get in them pockets and pull out that cash. At 3:15 in the break room, in the sponsor room, come on, there's stuff going on that y'all can be a part of, participate. Anything else? Nope. Okay. And you also know that these workshops are done by some creative and wonderful, fantastic people. So let's give each of them some respect. And if you have questions, be sure to walk up to them afterwards and ask the questions and take some pictures and share information. So this is all a cool, awesome family, right? Give yourselves a hand for being in here. This is wonderful. Okay, enough about me. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And she provided me some information so I don't mess it up. So Alexis is a design and product leader whose work focuses on creating experiences that enable people to create and engage with information. Very cool. She is currently as the head of design innovation at Automatic, where she is exploring the future of WordPress. Prior to coming on board at Automatic, she was the chief design officer at Axios and creative director of the New York Times R&D lab. So if you don't know what R&D is, that's research and development. Alexis writes and speaks extensively about the ways that humans and machines interact and how we design for constructive experiences with the technology around us. So let's give our presenter a big, warm welcome applause. Very good. How was that? Welcome.
Hi, everybody. How's everyone's WordCamp so far? Good? I'm always too short for these. So thank you so much to the organizers for having me here today and to this incredible community that I've gotten to know a bit more over the past couple of days. This is my first WordCamp. It's really exciting to see all the amazing work that's being built with WordPress as well as the creativity going into extending WordPress's capabilities. And when we talk about WordPress, we often talk about it as a tool for publishing. And today I want to take a bit of a deep dive into the act of digital publishing and how it's evolved over the lifespan of WordPress as a product. And as we do so, I want to specifically look at how those changes have had an impact on who the WordPress user is over time. So who is it that wants to create their own destination on the internet in the world of 2018 and beyond? And what are their motivations for doing so? So hopefully we can start to understand the present moment and context and then be able to anticipate the future of publishing in order to keep pace with both our users' needs and also emerging technologies. But before we do that, hi. That was an awesome intro. I just wanted to give you a really quick background about me and why I'm standing here talking about any of this. So as you've heard, I'm currently the head of design innovation at Automatic. I joined about 5 months ago, so I'm still pretty new. But prior to that, where I come from is that I've spent a lot of years working on the design of media experiences and publishing systems. So over the past decade or so, I've done that primarily in the context of news and media. Most recently heading up design at Axios, which is a news startup. So that was a lot of building reader-facing products and also our own custom CMS. And then also before that at the New York Times R&D lab, where we're doing much more kind of experimental, future-facing prototyping. So a lot of my work has been focused on tracking the kinds of changes I'm going to talk about today, so understanding how technological shifts change the constraints and possibilities for publishing, and then how we work with those new opportunities so that we can create great experiences for people to create and distribute and consume information. So that's what I hope to do today, take a little trip through the lifespan of WordPress and how changes in both technology and kind of the way people behave have impacted the trajectory of digital publishing during that time, and to understand what that means in terms of who the WordPress users are, and then talk about a little bit about where we might be headed next. So first, let's take a trip back to 2003, about the beginning of the WordPress timeline. And back then, if you think about digital publishing, publishing and making a website were one and the same thing. There was no other way to say something on the internet. Blogging was like the big innovation of the moment because it had introduced a slightly different mode of publishing, one which was more dynamic, more conversational, and less static than web publishing had been up to that point. And it was kind of such a big deal that it prompted all kinds of think pieces. Blogs were going to kill everything from marketing to the art of writing itself. We weren't sure if bloggers were journalists or if blogs were now newspapers. It was all very confusing. It was all very fraught. And it's kind of funny to look back at because, like, as we know from our vantage point now, this was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what was to come and the upheavals that were to come for digital publishing in the years after this. Because right now, at this point, whether you had a blog or a traditional site, the mechanism and the platform were the same. You still needed to build a website to publish anything online. So as a designer, one of my first questions is always, who is it for? Who's our user? And in this case, back in 2003, if you're designing publishing systems like WordPress, your user is basically everyone who wants to say something on the internet, because making a website is the only way to do that at the time, which is great in a way because, hey, you have a huge potential audience. But one of the first things that I learned in user experience design is that if everyone is the answer to who is it for, it's a really challenging proposition because you have to meet so many different needs and try to be all things to all people. And the digital publishing ecosystem really began to evolve in response to that challenge, as companies recognized that they could, instead of this singular thing, create better, more focused products for different kinds of users, different kinds of contexts, and different kinds of needs, especially as new technologies and affordances emerged. So first, early on, we saw platforms that were created to serve people who wanted to share particular kinds of media, specifically photos and videos. So Flickr and YouTube were launched in 2004, 2005, respectively. And they were kind of the poster children for what everyone took to calling Web 2.0. Raise your hand if you remember that term. Of course, there were some people who were skeptical. This is a quote from Tim Berners-Lee. Web 2.0 is, of course, a piece of jargon. Nobody even knows what it means. But those platforms specifically evolved in response to some new realities that had been emerging. So, for example, in the few years prior, digital cameras had become widely accessible, and photography and video creation, which was once really the province of specialists, became radically democratized. We were suddenly creating all of this visual content at alarming rates and didn't know what to do with it. So Flickr and YouTube not only offered a way to share photos with others in a way that leveraged the network of all the users that were on the platform, but since the content formats were so standardized, they leveraged that standardization to make the publishing process radically simpler. So to put your content online, there's all this stuff you no longer had to do. You didn't have to think about web pages or layout or code or design. You just uploaded your pictures and they were displayed on a standardized template that you didn't have to code or maintain. And that was kind of the first seed of the power of platforms in publishing. So a platform could do both of these things really well. It could connect people with each other, and it could also reduce the amount of work needed to publish. And those two affordances combined to massive impact in the subsequent rise of social platforms. So in 2003, we were here, and now in like 2006-ish, making websites isn't the only thing. Now you have these media platforms like Flickr and YouTube, which were good for specific kinds of publishing. So the use case for making a website is a little bit smaller, but it's still pretty dominant. But that changed pretty dramatically with the explosion of social media platforms. So there had been experiments before this, like Friendster and MySpace, but a really, really big shift happened with the nearly simultaneous launch of Twitter and the opening of public access to Facebook in 2007. Now, part of that is because of the power of platforms to connect people that we had just talked about. So suddenly, a subset of people who had been building websites to share information with the world suddenly had a much easier way to share information, and they could choose whether it was something that they really wanted to broadcast to everybody and share with the world, or just share more privately with the people that they knew. But part of their success was also about the greater efficiency of publishing. So this is a Wired piece from 2008 saying, thinking about launching your own blog, don't, and if you've already got one, pull the plug. And social multimedia sites like YouTube, Flickr, and Facebook have since made publishing pics and video as easy as typing text. So there is this ease, this efficiency of publishing, plus the network effect created a really, really big change. And on top of all of this, around the same time as social media was becoming ascendant, the teeny tiny little iPhone 1 in Steve Jobs' hand launched. And we all know about the impact that that had on just about everything. So in the years that followed, with the rise of mobile app ecosystems in concert with the kinds of platforms we were just talking about, collectively what happened is that publishing, this thing that we talk about as publishing, started to take on a really different character. So instead of this more formal and like labor-intensive process where I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna write something and I'm gonna construct this thing and I'm going to put it out there, and this kind of big intentional act. Publishing became ever more casual and personal and easy, and it was no longer like a dedicated activity for people, but an interstitial act that happened opportunistically between other moments in your life. It was a random thought shared between meetings or a snapshot taken on the street. And we started to see products that doubled down on that sort of constrained and casual and interstitial nature. So experiences like Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook stories brought the concept of ephemerality to the act of publishing, catering to those who didn't want to make a statement forever, but who simply wanted to communicate in the moment. And the more publishing became casual and conversational, in some cases it literally became a conversation. So as users spent more and more time in chat-based interfaces like Facebook Messenger and Slack and WeChat and others, those platforms began creating tools for publishers and business owners to publish into these kind of chat spaces. So over the past few years, we've seen tools for creating chatbots and finding ways to shift some aspects of publishing into more of a conversational paradigm. I don't necessarily think that's always a good idea, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. So what we've seen is that the world of the earlier web, where creating a website was the only way to share information, digital publishing started out as more of this long-form, serious, dedicated act. And all the platforms and tools that we've discussed so far have mostly capitalized on the ways that people might want to communicate in ways that are more casual and brief and interstitial. But if you wanted to do some serious, like, long-form writing, you still basically had two choices. You could either go get it published by a traditional media or news organization, which very few people have the inclination or knowledge or connections to do, or you could make a website, which is where a platform like Medium is really interesting. So Medium comes along and takes that simplicity and that ease of use that social platforms afforded and applies it to that longer form writing. So they successfully decoupled, like, I want to say something serious on the internet from I have to build and maintain a website, which is a really big deal for platforms like WordPress. Okay, so we once had this single format of publishing. We had a web page that contained text and media and these like page layouts, and it was consumed on one kind of device, on a desktop or laptop computer. And now we're in this world where we have a massive variety of formats that can be published through lots of different platforms and then consumed on lots of different devices and lots of different contexts. And it leads to just a lot of complexity. So in my years working with publishers and brands, people who were trying to like navigate this complex world and figure out what they needed would often ask me the question, like, what's going to win? Or like, tell me secretly, like, what's going to win? And there was this idea that, you had print, and like print was this stable thing for like news and media forever. And then like the web won over print, but then mobile came along and mobile won over the web, and so on and so on. And so the goal in asking that kind of question, for a media company at least, was to be able to kind of make a bet and double down on creating a business model that would work in like whatever that winning ecosystem or platform was going to be. So they're like, can we just like do everything on Facebook now? Is that what we should be doing? Is it VR? Everyone was trying to figure that out. And so my answer to that was always everything wins. Nothing goes away. None of this disappears. The future is accretive. And each of these formats and platforms is just another piece in this increasingly complex puzzle that is digital publishing. And for a long time in those conversations, my advice was that you kind of have to play everywhere, that you have to have this kind of fluid experience of your company or your brand or your news or whatever it is that you're creating, where people can experience it in all kinds of different contexts at different moments and different formats. But a few years ago, we got to a point where like that clearly wasn't a sustainable answer anymore because it's just so big and so complex. And playing in all of these places well is nearly impossible without an enormous budget and staff. Like each one of these takes dedicated effort. It's not just like a write once, publish everywhere. That like the format and the thought that goes into an Instagram story is different from something that's long form that you publish on a site, which is different from your Facebook page, et cetera, et cetera. So even working at places like the Times, which do have enormous budgets and staff, it's still really hard for them to think about playing everywhere. So what I do now is I tell people to really like take a close look at their business or their brand and understand two things. What are your core values? Who's your audience? So then you need to be selective and you need to choose the kinds of publishing or the kinds of platforms that allow you to best express those values and reach the audiences that are important to you, because not everyone's hanging out everywhere. And so that secret sauce, that particular combination, is going to look a little different for different people and companies. So coming back to this question, now that publishing looks really different than it did when we were talking about 2003, now that making a website is no longer the default option, but it's simply one choice amongst many, let's ask this question again. Who is WordPress for now? As we can see, the audience for a product like WordPress is no longer everybody who wants to say something on the internet, but it's rather a subset of those people. And the great news about that is that we can start to get a more specific picture of who our users are, which means that we can build tools with greater focus that more effectively serve their needs. Okay, so I'm going to take a little detour here for a minute. We're going to take a pause and do a bit of a guided meditation. This is an exercise that my colleague Rick Bannister made and gave me permission to adapt for this talk, because when he went through it, it really helped me to visualize like what the WordPress community is, who our users are. So I thought I would share it with you. So first, if you're comfortable doing so, close your eyes. Take a moment to notice the sensations of your body. Straighten your back. Take a deep breath. Relax your arms. Feel your breath moving in and out. Now imagine that you are standing in a field. The grass around you is green. There's a light breeze. The air is warm. Now with each breath in, imagine that you're getting lighter and lighter. Eventually, you get so light that you start to lift off the ground a little bit. With a little help from the breeze, you begin to float upwards. You fly around a bit, you get the hang of it, and then you take off for the clouds. As you rise higher and higher, going faster and faster, you see something down below you. You start to drift down, and as you get closer, the air gets smoggier, and you realize it's a vast metropolis. It's surrounded by foreboding concrete walls that are high and topped with barbed wire. It doesn't look very inviting from the outside. Inside, it's bustling. There's lots of honking traffic. There are people everywhere. The sound is deafening. You see people arguing in bars and fighting on street corners. There are billboards and advertisements everywhere touting every kind of good and service. It's noisy and dense and hard to navigate. The inhabitants don't seem particularly happy, but they can't leave. This is Facebook. You fly over the city, out of the smog and into clear air. As you fly, you encounter a sprawling suburbia. It has walls and hedges too, but they're shinier and newer. The residents are still bustling and chatting, but there's less fighting, less noise. Everyone's kind of focused on appearances. The streets and houses are more pleasant. The people pay a lot of attention to how they dress. But all the houses kind of look the same, and they're all square and boxy and identical. And they're all on identical streets in a perfect grid, even though the residents have done a lot of work to paint them different colors and give them personality. When you look closer at some of the houses, you realize they're actually just billboards made to look like someone lives there. This is Instagram. You float back up and want to see what else is out there in the world. As the suburbs fade into the distance, the rest of the world comes into focus on the horizon. 32% of it, anyway. You see farmsteads in remote corners of the countryside. You see riverside factories. You see backpackers on mountainsides. You see small settlements and emerging new cities. You see apartment buildings and straw huts, sprawling homesteads and local churches. You even see a few people attempting to climb over the walls of the big city from before. This diverse group of people value their freedom, but they dream of some of the comforts of city and suburban life. Utilities and services, same-day mail, cable TV, corner stores with all the amenities. They want ways to make their houses bigger and stronger. They want tools to make their businesses more valuable for customers and roads to connect them to other people. This is WordPress. Eventually, you fly past the last settlement, and you find yourself back in an open field. And as your breathing slows, with each exhale, you get heavier and heavier until eventually you settle back down to earth. And slowly, you open your eyes. Thanks for coming on that little journey with me. So, so in 2018, in a world where I can start writing or sharing information about my business in minutes on one of the multitudes of platforms I just discussed, in this context, why would I build my own website or blog? Why would I put in the effort that it takes to design and build and maintain my own destination on the internet? Because no matter how elegant we make the product, doing that is always going to require more effort and money and dedication than the alternatives. And also, a thing to understand is that a lot of people who are owning and making websites, they don't care about making a website, they care about what it helps them achieve or the problems it can help them solve. It's a means to an end. So let's talk about what a website might afford for a user that the alternatives can't. The first thing that seems clear is that creating your own website affords an exponentially higher degree of control than participating in a platform. So while Facebook offers features for businesses, they might not be the right feature for your business. While Medium offers tools for writers, they might not be the right ones for how you want to write. So the freedom to control what tools and features you use to achieve your goals is a huge advantage that may very well be worth dedicating that extra time and effort to. Furthermore, if your goal is to be a destination, like if you're a publisher or you aspire to be a major brand, then you want, in fact, to be a destination. You want the storefront. You don't want real estate in someone else's strip mall. And again, this comes back to control. You get to control the context in which your readers or customers encounter you. Secondly, we're currently in a moment of a lot of disillusionment with the massive monopoly on our content and personal data that is in the hands of a few platforms. And those platforms are almost universally run on advertising-driven models where your data primarily exists to serve the needs of those advertisers rather than you. So I can't predict how much that skepticism will grow or how big a backlash there'll be or what the impact of that is, but I would argue that there's increasingly a value of freedom in owning your data and owning your content and not being subject to the business decisions of massive platforms that may or may not have your best interests at heart. And finally, while I just said that a lot of users don't care about the website, they only care what it gets for them, I don't want to forget the segment of people who still view the web itself as a medium for expression and creativity. So what I hope that we can retain and revive from the days of the early web is that Cambrian explosion of creativity that used the tools of the medium itself. So the older web was more rudimentary, but it was clay, it was the thing we worked with, it was material for creating. And some of what was created was gaudy or ridiculous, we all remember GeoCities, but it was craft. It was our own creation. It wasn't some shiny cookie cutter assemblage that we made from a kit. So while we can appreciate the elegance and the gloss and the ease of use of the tools and platforms that we have available to us today, they still feel kind of prescriptive and limiting and kind of dull. So why not have the ability to reclaim the tools of our digital space and put our hands in that clay and see what we can make? And so there's this element of unique personal expression and craft that's only possible when you make your own thing. So control, freedom, and craft. This isn't an exhaustive list, I'm sure, but these are the kind of values that I keep coming back to that are reasons that drive WordPress users when they come to WordPress to make their own thing rather than spinning up yet another Facebook page. So how do we design for that? I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening now that I think ties into these needs, and then pose some ideas about how we might further innovate looking a bit into the future. So one of the reasons that I'm excited about Gutenberg is because I think it does speak to these values and needs. The core design principle of Gutenberg is that of direct control. So rather than kind of handling your content in one place and then having to manage how it's presented indirectly and navigate a bunch of menus, it brings those actions together to allow you to directly manipulate the content and presentation of your site in place and see those changes as we make them. And so what direct manipulation does is it gives the user better control and more flexibility to determine how they want their site to work. They can control the layout and features of a page directly by adding and customizing blocks rather than having to rely on the complexity of widgets and shortcodes and embeds and things that feel pretty arcane to a lot of people who are just starting out, especially. And while Gutenberg is in its infancy now, I imagine a fully grown-up version being something that really makes the open web fully editable in a direct way, in a way that really allows for that deep kind of craft and virtuosity. But I want to think beyond what we can do right now. So how do we not just catch up with current practices, but move forward and leapfrog them? So at the R&D lab at the Times, we often talked about working in the realm of the newly possible. So tools or technologies that had recently emerged but hadn't kind of reached full utilization or their full expression yet. So what kinds of newly possible technologies might change the way that we think about publishing? So I'm going to do a really quick run through of just some of the most immediate possibilities that come to mind. These are more questions I'm posing and not full product concepts, but hopefully they will get conversation started. So one of the things that, and Gary mentioned a bunch of these in his talk yesterday too, so let's think about voice UIs. So this is something that has obviously come to a lot more maturity and viability over the past few years. So we've seen not only technology that's embedded in existing devices like Siri and Google Assistant on our phones, but also new devices that extend voice control to our homes and our physical spaces. So are there ways in which WordPress users might be served by the integration of voice technology into the publishing process? In what circumstances might voice inputs be a better option than text inputs? Maybe there are particular kinds of content that you might want to publish via voice. Or perhaps there are actions like getting your daily site statistics or fulfilling an incoming e-commerce order that you might be able to easily automate via voice commands. And maybe this kind of interaction provides new affordances for specific groups of users and gives us the opportunity to make WordPress more inclusive and more accessible. Or we can look at things like augmented reality, especially when we see things like iOS 12 integrating AR into the browser with AR Quick Look. So what does an AR website afford? You can imagine ways that might be a technology that users like e-commerce site owners might want to take advantage of. So what does the authoring experience in WordPress look like for an AR website? How do you make that easy? How do you make that accessible? There are all these really meaty, interesting questions there. Or we can think about AI and machine learning, which is a really big topic, but the way I like to approach this is that when people talk about AI, they think about how you can replace human labor with computation. But I really like to think about AI more like this exoskeleton here. So something that can collaborate with people rather than replace them, a way of creating superpowers for ourselves. And so when we think about that, we have to think about like, well, what are the things that machines can do that humans can't do really well? So they can do things like they can process information really quickly, they can do complex calculations, they can remember things perfectly and store that information at scale. So how do we use those affordances to do something that I can't rather than mimic something that I already can? So how does machine intelligence give WordPress users superpowers? How does it augment their abilities or allow them to do something that's currently really labor-intensive for them? If we look at something like Gmail's new Smart Compose feature, which I know people probably have very mixed feelings about, but you can imagine machine learning and predictive text being able to assist users in creating content. And we know that content creation step can be really intimidating for people, especially if you're not a writer by trade, if this is something new to you. So are there ways that machines can help provide assistance there? Or we can apply machine learning to extrapolate patterns from traffic and engagement data to give site owners kind of a more meaningful narrative and understanding about how people are engaging with their website and how what they do impacts that. But as we think about all of these new technologies, it's really important in my mind not just to use them because we can, like, hey, a new toy we can play with, but again to think about this idea of affordances. So what does this particular technology do especially well? And then how does that intersect with the goals and needs of our users? So an example of how that can go poorly is if we look at like chatbots and conversational UI in the past couple of years. People started making everything a chatbot for not necessarily particularly good reasons. And the fact is that people weren't designing with a critical eye to what the key affordances of chatbots are, and that led to a lot of bad experiences. So you had bots that felt like a regular UI was shoved awkwardly into a conversational interface, or bots that tried to inject these really fake chatty personalities when the user is just trying to like get something done, or just plain old failed interactions like this one. Yeah, that's not good. So that brings us back to this. Humans are really good at conversations. We understand sarcasm, we can read between the lines, hopefully, and we're constantly leveraging contextual information in order to interpret what's happening in the conversation. So computers aren't great at that, so let's not like make them try to do that. Chatbots aren't interesting for their own sake. It's not that we love to talk to computers and we're all dying to have a conversation with a bot. They're compelling when they can create efficiency for a user, when they can better integrate into the context that you're in, or they can reduce the number of steps that you need to take to achieve a goal. So as we look at all of these emerging technologies, whether it's voice or AR or AI or anything else that comes down the path, it's not just a question of what can they do, but what can they do uniquely well? And more importantly, what can they do that speak to these values? So as I think about innovation in the context of WordPress, it's with these values and these user needs in mind. And it's this opportunity we have to really make a product that serves a focused set of needs rather than trying to be all things to all people. Because publishing isn't just one thing anymore. We can't be everything to everyone. Some of those people are just going to want an Instagram account, and that's okay. But how do we serve the people who do want that website, who want a home for their ideas or their business? How can we provide tools that enable not just productivity, but virtuosity? How do we provide compelling tools for making and for craft in a world of platforms that push standardization and convenience? And how do we leverage the new contexts and technologies of 2018 and in the future to create the best expression of WordPress? And as we explore these possible answers, innovation should mean doubling down on those values of craft, control, and freedom, and really letting them shine at the heart of the WordPress experience. Thank you very much, and take some questions if you want.
See right here. Before she goes, I want to make a little presentation as a first-time speaker, right?
At WordCamp, yeah.
At WordCamp. Give her a great round of applause, please. Very good. Now, just briefly, in my family, what we do is when we meet first-time speakers, we welcome them, but we also give them a WAPU to remember their experience and encourage them to continue to speak. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
All right, you're welcome.
Do we have time for Q&A or do we?
So you want to do it?
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
we
can do a
have
couple
some
of
time for a couple of questions, not a dissertation or anything, but just some brief questions. Thank you. Okay.
Hey, was interested in how you see the Gutenberg editor specifically playing into like major publishers. I know like the New York Post, for example, like what is their take on where Gutenberg is headed, and do you see this as a serious like publishing editor?
Absolutely, I think it can be. I mean, like I said, this is the beginning of Gutenberg, and I think it's only going to get richer and more expansive, especially even just the kinds of block libraries we're already starting to see emerge. And I think we'll see more and more specialized ones that will allow for this really powerful experience, not just for an individual publisher, but for someone who's operating at a scale like the New York Post or the Times or Washington Post or any of them.
Hello, I'm from Knoxville. I'm actually from Knox Makers, so we're a makerspace, 501c3 nonprofit. So you're speaking right to the heart of some stuff that I've been really, really thinking about and passionate about. We're looking at like 3D modeling for 3D printing, Arduino, Raspberry Pis, a lot of this stuff, laser cutting, even fabric arts, things like that. And I'm talking about crafters and makers trying to get their name out there, but without compromising the integrity of, I don't want to look like every other website. Like how do we do that? Mm-hmm. Are you all looking at tapping into the resources of the maker movement, maker spaces, hacker spaces, and trying to see how we can bridge the gap between that and WordPress?
I haven't explicitly, but I think that's a fantastic idea. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this.
All right. Well, I will be around if anybody wants to grab me and ask any further questions. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.